Welcome everyone to this online event on Is the End in Sight? The Monarchy and Commonwealth Realms. I am Dr. Sue Onslow. I'm Acting Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and it gives me great pleasure to moderate this discussion between three experts on the role position of the monarchy in Commonwealth realms and who can offer us their criticisms, their comments, but also their perception of future developments over the short and the longer term. Our first speaker will be Professor Anne Twomey, who is currently Professor of Constitutional Law, Director also of the Constitutional Reform Unit at the University of Sydney's Law School. Professor Twomey has practiced as a solicitor and is admitted to practice in the New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT and the High Court in Australia. She's worked for the High Court of Australia as a senior research officer, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service as a researcher in the Law and Government Group, the Commonwealth Senate as the Secretary to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Committee, and the Cabinet Office of New South Wales as Policy Manager of the Legal Branch. Professor Twomey is, of course, with particular relevance to today's discussion, author of The Veiled Sceptre, Reserve Powers of Heads of State in Westminster Systems, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Our second speaker will be my colleague and former director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Professor Philip Murphy. Professor Murphy is Professor of British and Commonwealth History at the University of London and is now Director of History and Policy at the Institute of Historical Research. He's author of Monarchy and the End of Empire, The House of Windsor, the British Government, and the Post-War Commonwealth, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and author also of The Empire's New Clothes, published in 2018. Our third speaker is Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, who is Professor of Constitutional Governance and Politics at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. In addition to her work on Caribbean politics, Professor Barrow-Giles has served as a member of the St. Lucia Constitution Reform Commission and several election monitoring groups. Professor Barrow-Giles's publications include Introduction to Caribbean Politics, Text and Readings, published in 2002, and Living in the Borderlands, Issues in Caribbean Sovereignty and Development, published in 2003. I must note that both Professor Murphy and Professor Barrow-Giles are involved in The Visible Crown, which is a major interdisciplinary project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This is a team of researchers in the UK and the Caribbean who are interrogating the political and cultural significance of Queen Elizabeth II in the Caribbean, covering both the countries and dependencies where she remains head of state, and also the four countries which opted to become republics: Barbados, Dominica, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. Barbados's recent move to republic status on the 30th of November of 2021 has raised questions about the history and future of the monarchy, I should say, in the Caribbean. Why, this project asked, has Barbados succeeded in this endeavour where other Caribbean states have failed? And to what extent is there political will or popular support to effect such a change elsewhere? Well, elsewhere, of course, goes beyond the Caribbean. And if I could invite our first speaker, because of course Australia is still a Commonwealth realm, to begin with her remarks, Professor Anne Twomey.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, a bit ahead of you in time, so I'm already in the evening here in Sydney. So in my talk this evening, what I'm proposing to do is just start with some comments on the Crown, its divisibility, and how we came to the situation where the Queen is a woman of many crowns, and then move on to Australia and the Republic issue. So interestingly, if we start at the very beginning of Queen Elizabeth II's life in 1926, she was born at a time when the Crown was still considered to be one and indivisible. But it was not long after it, in fact, in the same year in 1926, in November, that we had the Imperial Conference, where you got the Balfour Declaration and you have that assertion of the equality of the dominions with the United Kingdom. And then flowing from that in 1926 and again in the Imperial Conference in 1940, 1830, we get the acceptance that the monarch acts on the advice of ministers who are responsible to the Parliament of the relevant dominions. And it's that causes the divisibility of the crown. So that's the point at which we see different crowns, because the monarch is being advised by ministers of different countries in relation to their powers in that particular dominion. Dominion as it was and realm as it is now. And we saw that divisibility of the crown working out in reality in 1936 with the abdication of Edward VIII, because there was a period of time from the 10th to the 12th of December of that year where there were different kings, so either Edward VIII or George VI, in different dominions over those 3 days. So the Queen herself, when she came to the throne in 1952, she came with 7 dominions, so she had 7 crowns. In the course of her period as Queen, she lost 3 of those. So Ceylon, as it was then, now Sri Lanka, Pakistan and South Africa left. But the ones that remain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, are probably, I guess, considered the anchors really in terms of the various realms. Now, since that time, there has been significant expansion and then contraction in terms of the realms. So what we saw in the trajectory is British colonies that became independent and became realms under the Queen as head of state, and then some of them eventually becoming republics. So in my count, and it's actually a bit tricky to know how to count them, particularly when you get to Rhodesia, but anyway, my count there is that since that point of when she became Queen and had those 7 realms to begin with, we got 26 new realms, 11 of which remain realms, in addition to the others that were already there, and 16 of the 26 became republics. Now, over time, we're going to see that we'll no longer have the up trajectory of new realms because there just aren't really enough colonies left to turn into independent places, independent countries, but we will see a gradually movement towards a republic, as we recently did in Barbados. Now, that brings me to Australia and Australia's position. So throughout Australia's history, even before the Commonwealth of Australia came to being in the 1890s, there was a Republican movement in Australia. So there's always been a Republican movement, a movement that's actually probably been stronger than in other places like Canada and New Zealand. But it took on quite a strong form with significant leadership from Paul Keating back in 1999. In the period leading, 1993, he started it off, and eventually we ended up with a referendum in 1999. Now, the difficulty that we had then is the difficulty that we have now in relation to a republic. And the problem is the disagreement within Australia as to how you would replace the Queen. The issue is not so much support for the monarchy per se or support for the theory of hereditary monarchy, if it was just a single vote as to whether or not you preferred to have monarchy or republic. Certainly back in 1999, republic would have won, and probably even today, republic would also win. The Queen is effectively Queen of Australia by default, and that is because no one can agree on how to replace her. The fundamental problem is that back in 1999, the people who supported the direct election of the head of state joined with monarchists to defeat a referendum that would have involved the choosing of a head of state by way of Parliament through a 2/3 majority of both houses of Parliament choosing the head of state. So it wasn't a direct election from the people, but it was an election through Parliament on a bipartisan basis. Now, that was defeated in 1999 because there was a strong movement in support of the direct election by the people of the head of state. And the direct electionists believed at the time that if they defeated the referendum in 1999, that there would then be followed another referendum which would allow for direct election, and that never happened. Why, you might ask? It's because those people who are concerned about the operation of the political system in Australia, and perhaps we should call them elites because I guess they are, so politicians, lawyers, constitutional lawyers like me and other people, were worried that if we had a directly elected president, that they would then have a mandate, and that mandate would be a popular mandate, and that would come into conflict at some point with the Prime Minister. So the essential concern is that direct election will lead to destabilising the political system in Australia. And so this continues to be the problem today. If you ask the public about a republic, they would say that they want to have a say in choosing who the head of state is. But equally, they would also say that they don't want a politician to be the head of state. And one of the problems we have in Australia is that when people talk about a republic, they immediately think of a president and they think of the United States, even though it's a completely different system and nobody was ever intending there to be a presidential style of system in Australia. But then they think of Donald Trump and then they think, well, we really don't want that kind of a system. And the problem here is that no one has ever managed to get the public to think of, well, if you directly elect a person, you get a politician. And there's this disconnect between the two ideas. And while that's happening, the Republican proposal is not going very far because the elites still won't support a directly elected head of state. The public want a directly elected head of state, but the type of directly elected head of state they want is a person who'd never run in a public election. It's just a bit of a mess. So that's essentially where we got to. In quite recent times, the Australian Republican Movement, which is a body, the ARM, did some significant work on trying to create a new model for the Republic. They call this the Australian Choice Model. And the idea here was to try and satisfy the public urge to have direct election while at the same time cutting off the possibility that a directly elected head of state would have a mandate, and in particular doing so by limiting the reserved powers that that person would have. So taking away, for example, any power to prevent, or block assent to laws. So no ability, royal assent just being a given and the head of state having no power in that regard. No ability to dismiss the Prime Minister unless they've lost the confidence of the House, and a few other sorts of limitations. And the other thing that they proposed was that in relation to the election of the head of state, while it would be a direct election, it would be done on the basis that the people who ran in that election would be chosen. So there'd be a nominee of each of the different states. So each state could put up one nominee, and then the Commonwealth government could put up a maximum of 3 nominees, and there'd be election from amongst them. And the idea there is that instead of having politicians running representing political parties in the election, each of the jurisdictions would choose someone like the sort of people that we have at the moment doing vice-regal roles, the sort of people who normally wouldn't run in an election. Don't know how you're going to get them to agree, but nonetheless. And also to try and have some kind of election that is depoliticised. So political parties don't run. Maybe you put limits on, advertising, costs of running, donations, all those sorts of things. So that's the proposal that the ARM put up. They put it up a couple of months ago, so before the federal election. It didn't get a lot of traction, to be fair, but the point of putting it up, and they did put up a fully drafted, here's how the Constitution would look. So all the provisions, there's a full set of it out there. They got constitutional experts to do the drafting. I was asked to be on their panel. I decided not to be because I wanted to retain my independence and not be tied to anything, but I did help out the people who were doing that. So it's quite a well-drafted model. What level of success it would have at the moment, probably not great, but it's one of those things where events will make the difference. So the death of the Queen, the movement towards, when Prince Charles becomes King of Australia, that might be the impetus for people to look at this more seriously. So the last point is that Sue raised with me earlier, and that is the question of, well, what's the change of government in Australia mean for all of this? And the answer is not a lot. So I did note there was a headline on the front of the UK Times saying, oh my goodness, the Republicans have taken over in Australia and it'll, the Queen will be gone, etc. It's not really the case. We do have a new Labor government. The new Prime Minister does support a republic, so there's no doubt about that. So there is the potential for leadership there. But the point to make is that the new Labor government has accepted that the republic is at least a second order issue. So the first order is to try and change the constitution to achieve recognition of Indigenous people in the constitution. And that in itself is another whole story, which is very complicated and will take a lot of work to build a consensus. So we're talking at least a good couple of years before that ever gets to a referendum, and any work on the republic is behind that. So there's just no real prospect of a republic in this term of government. Possibly in the next term of government if they have success on Indigenous constitutional recognition. But if that fails and falls over at a referendum, likelihood of a republic coming up and going to referendum in Australia, pretty slim, subject to, of course, whatever happens in the United Kingdom with the transition from the Queen to a new king, which of course events potentially can change things. But at the moment, I don't think we're moving to a republic very fast here. I will pass it back to Sue.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. So as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan said, events do boy events. So thank you very much indeed for that bang up-to-date analysis. Philip, if I could invite you to make your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Sue. I really just want to make three points. And the first arises from Anne's comments, that the system is incredibly complex and poorly understood. I mean, there are a handful of people, I think, who understand the system. One is Anne, one is Cynthia, and the other is the Queen. And that has always been a kind of a problem with this. And I think it was recognised as a problem in the UK as early as the early 60s, when a series of African states moved very rapidly from being independent realms to becoming republics. And I think it was well understood in London that actually this was natural. It was a part of those countries sort of presenting to the world the fact that they were fully independent. And that the system of the realms really opened up all sorts of misunderstandings. So that, if anything, the British government was pushing those countries to become republics for simplicity's sake. And when Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, for example, moved from being a realm to a republic in 1976, the feeling in London was that actually it would simplify relations. It would remove the basis for misunderstandings. And those misunderstandings persist, and they apply to the Commonwealth as a whole. You saw in March, just before Kate and William flew out to the Caribbean for their tour, the headline in the Daily Express was "Kate and William will fly to save the Commonwealth," as though the Commonwealth was dependent on the realms. Again, the distinction between the realms and the Queen as head of the Commonwealth is poorly understood. Last year, the Merco press agency, which operates largely in South America, ran the headline "Barbados to quit British Commonwealth effective December the 1st." And that headline remained up despite being patently wrong. And it links to a kind of broader problem of perceptions around the Commonwealth and how it relates to the British Empire. There was a headline in the right-wing news site Op India recently, "British Empire to shrink further after Barbados, more Caribbean countries plan to become republics. So I think that the whole complexity of the system is itself problematic. And it was problematic also in terms of some of the issues of protocol involved. We know that the recent royal visits by the Cambridges and the Wessexes to the Caribbean were problematic. They're partly problematic because of misunderstandings about what was going on. And there was a very interesting seminar which the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton ran online recently, looking at the perceptions of people of Caribbean diaspora origin of those tours. And this term that came up was the royals came uninvited. Well, of course it wasn't uninvited, but the nature of that transaction, what the nature of the buy-in of those Caribbean countries that they visited was not really properly set out, and arguably should have been set out. So complexity is and remains a problem. And it's why, in a sense, the British government would be fairly happy if someone waved a magic wand and all the realms became republics, or at least some in the British government would, because it simplifies that relationship. And if and when there is another referendum in Australia, or referendum campaigns in the Caribbean, you can be sure that it would become accompanied by a certain amount of anti-British rhetoric about breaking the chains of colonialism and slavery. Again, the British government would see that as a misunderstanding, but it is, in terms of soft power diplomacy, a bit of a problem. Second issue that I want to raise is, I think, a growing gap between perceptions of the role of the royal family and the value of the royal family in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And I was very struck by the speech that Archbishop John Sentamu gave at the Commonwealth Day service in the Abbey this year in March. And even having been somewhat inured to what I've sometimes referred to as late imperial British Shintoism on the part of some sort of Commonwealth supporters, I was rather taken aback by how heavily Sentamu laid it on. Just to quote from some of that, he said, "For 70 years, the Queen has modelled her reign on the one who said, 'Whoever shall be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever desires to be first shall be the slave of all.' How blessed are we in our sovereign, keeping herself in the love of God. The virtues of the Christian ideals of love of neighbour and compassion have given shape to the Queen's leadership, conforming her life to the example of Jesus Christ, her insight into God, the world, self and others, her wisdom to know that her continual servanthood to the people of the Commonwealth depends on God alone, her companionship and friendship of Christ in joy and desolation is at the heart of the growth of her life of Christ-likeness." And I do think that we know that Whitehall doesn't have much of an institutional memory left. And I think that there'd probably be a danger that policymakers in the UK would assume from that the Queen is universally revered across the Commonwealth. And yet we know from reactions in the Caribbean recently that there are very different perceptions, that the royal family is seen by some as a symbol of imperial domination, as a symbol of imperial nostalgia, as a symbol of white privilege. And hence the calls on the visiting royals to engage in apologies, to assist in reparations for the profits of colonialism and slavery. And I think that may be one reason why I think the British establishment was slightly taken aback by the reactions to the Caribbean bean tours and slightly blindsided. And the final point I want to make very, very briefly is that I think that the British monarchy struggles, as do other parts of, if you like, the permanent state, when you move out of periods of consensus into periods of political division. You could see that in the 1980s, divisions not just within the UK over Mrs. Thatcher's policies, but also within the Commonwealth over South Africa, left the Queen and the royal family in a slightly vulnerable position, slightly exposed position. And we've moved back to this very polarized position with, of course, Brexit as this very divisive shibboleth in the UK. And Brexit, which may finally succeed in breaking up the United Kingdom, which of course is one of the things alongside the Commonwealth, which has mattered most to the Queen. Bringing the unification of Ireland closer, perhaps, and certainly providing an impetus to Scottish independence. Now, we know that the SNP at the moment works on the basis that an independent Scotland would remain a monarchy. But there was an interesting poll by British Future earlier this month, which pointed out that now only 45% of Scots want to retain a monarchy when the Queen dies. And one can imagine that debate being reignited, particularly, if there's a hung parliament after the next general election, in which a Labour government is dependent on SNP support, that could begin a sort of new kind of process. And I think more broadly, on the back of COVID, the war in Ukraine, we are moving towards a kind of global recession with great distress being caused in parts of the developing world, never mind in the UK. And I think those divisions across the world, again, will focus attention on the monarchy as a symbol of privilege, and may create further problems in the future. So those are 3 points to kick off with.
No, thank you very much indeed, Philip. Cynthia, you're making notes. Would you like to make your remarks, please?
Yes, sure. Good morning, and thank you again for inviting me. I was just making a note with reference to a couple of the comments that Philip made. Quite interesting. One has to do with the complexity of the situation and the extent to which many of us do, in fact, understand that which we are expected to make comments on. So, Philip, just to thank you for including me in this small circle of persons who apparently understand the complexity of the situation. I beg to differ. You would recall quite recently I was very happy that you were able to, I think, shed some light on the process of the separation of some of the realms and the transition to republicanism. I think that was very interesting, certainly in terms of the debate for the general public. And you were so, so generous with your time in trying to explain to us on that panel discussion that we held on republicanism in Barbados. So I want to thank you for that. The other points that I just quickly want to note is the fact that some of your discussion, and again, I don't agree, and perhaps it's because I'm coming from the Caribbean and I have a very Caribbean perspective on this, whereas you have a very British perspective on this, and certainly there seemed to be a disconnect between how the British perceive things and how we in the Caribbean perceive those very things. But this is not the first time I'm hearing talk about the misunderstandings about the intent and the purpose and the process, if you want to put it that way, of the royal visits to the Caribbean. But certainly I think that to a certain extent, the British seem to be very blind to the visceral sort of reactions that we have in the Caribbean to this current round of visits of the royal. And there are the questions as to why that is the case. And when I start my presentation, I in fact want to begin by making reference to the response, the reaction, almost instinctive reaction of one of the prime ministers in the region to the visit of the royals. But I do want to make the point in terms of my contribution to today's discussion that it is very clear that perhaps in recent memory, there has been no other period quite as profound in the Caribbean as this present moment is in fact shaping out to be, certainly in relation to constitutional developments. And so I just broadly want to just throw out there some of the issues that certainly we need to take in consideration. And that is, of course, the most obvious, that is the discussions currently underway in the Caribbean, given the decision of Barbados to move to republic. That follows, of course, a little over a decade following the debate we had in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as to whether or not St. Vincent should become a republic. But we're seeing the conversation certainly taken off in countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines again, Antigua and Barbuda and Jamaica. These are but the three where I think there has probably been the more developed of the discussions around, further constitutional development in the islands. The second thing that I believe we should not discount is the decision by yet another Caribbean country, and coming after a hiatus of several years, to move from the Privy Council to, of course, the Caribbean Court of Justice, and I'm talking about St. Lucia. And so there is also the uncertainty about the future of the remaining realms with and the ability or the desire to continue to access the Privy Council. Again, we cannot, and I'm hearing it in the conversation so far, but certainly, Philip and Sue, you have both mentioned, I think, but certainly we cannot forget the discussions about reparations. And I think that is why, of course, the Republican discussions have become more frontal. And it's largely because of the mobilizing that has been taking place around the discussions on reparations. We know that, in fact, very many of the local commissions, certainly in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Grenada, have been very vocal on vocal on the issue of reparations and hostility and opposition to the visit of the royals in the Caribbean. We must also, I think, not forget what I could describe as a very compromised or weakened UK Caribbean relations. And that weakened UK Caribbean relations is very much wrapped up in the Windrush scandal or crisis. And certainly for many Caribbean people, it seems that the UK Foreign Office or the UK government, and we sometimes do not make a distinction between the UK government and, of course, the monarchy, that notwithstanding all that is taking place in the Caribbean, notwithstanding the response to the royal visits, that the UK have continued its deportation flights, certainly to Jamaica, as recent as, I think, around the 18th of May, just last week. Yes. There was another deportation flight. Yes, it's only a few persons, but we are certainly concerned about this, especially in the context where the reparations committee have been, demanding certain support from the British government. I think too we should not deny the importance of what is now taking place in the BVI. The standoff between the government, the local government, and of course the British government. It is very clear that the threat, which is not a veiled threat but an open threat by the UK to introduce direct rule in the BVI, has been very important. It certainly has impacted, Caribbean people and the more progressive Caribbean people. It certainly have impacted, I would say, the academic community in a very profound way. And there is the view that, in fact, the threat, which is now being denied by the governor, a very open threat, is regarded as something which is very real. And for many in the Caribbean, and at the level of the OECS in particular, regard the action as yet another example of British imperialism at its worst. The unfortunate thing is that we can't, I think, separate a discussion or perception of British colonialism from what is in fact taking place in the Caribbean at this present moment. Now, the discussion around, or the veiled threat and the open threat of the governor, whether or not it is something that is realizable, is in fact coming some 16 years after the British government suspended major parts of the 2006 Turks and Caicos Island Constitution. And that introduced very direct rule by the governor, which was subject to the directions from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We also know that at the time, of course, there was suspension of ministerial government and the proceedings of the House of Assembly. And for people in the Caribbean, we regard that as another extreme example of the UK taking full control of one of the bots, which is again we believe very likely with the British Virgin Islands. Now, at the time of the suspension of the government of the Turks and Caicos in 2006, CARICOM and certainly the OECS had written very strong letters of concern. And this time around, we're seeing the OECS in particular pledging support to the government of the British Virgin Islands to reform its governance practices. In other words, the OECS position is that certainly the British government should not, it should be, in fact, the last resort to suspend the government of the BVI and allow the local government, with the support of other Caribbean governments, to work out some of the clear governance difficulties that there are in the country. So what we do not want to see is that similar to what took place with the new constitution of Turks and Caicos in 2011, we do not want to see any diminution of the powers of the local government. We certainly do not want to see the strengthening of the power of the governor and the and the UK government. And so the actions of what we are seeing in the BVI is certainly not going unnoticed. I don't want to talk about, of course, what is currently going on in relation. That's another issue. I don't want to collapse the two things, but I certainly don't want to speak about the concerns of CARICOM governments right now in relation to Baroness Scotland and the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. That is but yet another issue. So in the time available to me to discuss the report, what I want to do is to discuss the Republican conversation and the status in the Caribbean. And as I indicated a while ago, for me, a good starting point is really the royal visits to the Caribbean. I was really taken aback when I saw, in a certain sense, Prime Minister Philip J. Pierre of St. Lucia, his response to I suppose, what Philip might describe as courtesy, usual, not so unusual expression of support, etc. But certainly for me, the expression of Prime Minister, the point is Prime Minister Philip J. Pierre is not known to be very expressive. And I think a lot of us would have seen his expression of disbelief, which could easily be contrasted quite eerily with his opposite, and that is the pride from the two royals at the symbolic gift to mark the occasion of the royal visit. And for me, that is very symbolic, very suggestive of where we are right now in the Caribbean. That for me, therefore, more so than the frank and perhaps brutal positions articulated by the prime ministers of both Antigua and Barbados and Jamaica as to the next logical step in the political evolution of the Caribbean, has been one of the most revealing developments recently in the Caribbean. So the stark contrast of pride on the one hand and the astonishment, I would say, disbelief at perhaps what one can call audacity of the British at this time, when the entire Caribbean is in the throes of a conversation of terminating the royals as the head of state, on the one hand, is in fact symbolic of what I think is a very deep divide between the British and the Caribbean over the relevancy of the monarchy today, as well as the contending positions over the demands for reparations for the savagery of, as it has been described, of slavery and British colonialism in the Caribbean. And so for me, this is quite easily the tale of the difference between the British monarchy and the British government and the Caribbean with respect to the political environment in the region today. And it appears that British scholars, for instance, have taken, sorry Philip, but have taken the smug and sometimes dismissive view that the Caribbean's demand for reparation, on which the Caribbean political leadership appears at this point in time to be united, the view that it is, in fact, I've heard that it is dead in the water and not to be contemplated by the British state, is something which is very vexatious to the Caribbean. We must too not forget that the Caribbean state or Caribbean states have been the most loyal to the idea of the constitutional monarchy. But today, there clearly are increasing tensions between the British and the English Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, not least among which has been the and part of that increasing tension has, of course, been the treatment of Caribbean nationals in Britain, to which I referred to earlier. I would like us, and I think Philip has done a fairly good job in that, but it is important for us to, and I just want to reiterate, it is sometimes easy for us to forget or ignore the fact that republicanism is not something new on the radar, the political radar of the Caribbean. In fact, it has never been off the political agenda of the Caribbean political as well as academic elites. And this is in fact true of the countries that sought independence from Britain in the 1970s, as it was for those countries which felt the need to review their constitutions in the context of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Yes, we can admit that the first wave of republicanism was in fact in the Caribbean 4 decades ago. And in fact, it did occur in the context of the pro-black power and socialist movements in the region. Very, very profound developments in the region. And given what was taking place in countries like Trinidad and Tobago in particular, it is very clear that the political elites saw this as an opportunity, an opportune moment to embrace republicanism and in so doing terminate the formal constitutional connections with the British monarchy. But there were others who felt that the political and economic developments in the 1970s were in themselves too destabilizing to risk tampering with the constitution in a way that might have invited greater instability. And I refer, for instance, to Barbados. It is very clear when you look at the first constitutional, post-independence constitutional reform commission that they were very fearful that what was taking place in Trinidad and Tobago in the Black Power movement would have destabilized Barbados, and therefore, for that reason, given the potential for instability already, that it was best for Barbados to retain what most Barbadians were very familiar with and very happy with at the time. And that is, of course, continuing to be a constitutional monarchy. So it is the case that the Republican drive may have had a hiatus in the 1980s, and it did not revive until the 1990s, and certainly in the early 21st century. So in the last quarter century, what we have seen is that several Caribbean countries have in fact established or did in fact establish constitutional review or reform commissions, and for the express purpose of determining whether our independent constitutions were in fact fit for purpose as independent countries. But certainly one of the key things in terms of the remit of these various constitutional review and constitutional reform commissions was to determine whether or not the Caribbean countries, the relevant Caribbean countries, should continue as constitutional monarchies. I would say that when we look at these various constitutional reform and review commissions, and almost every single Caribbean country have in fact established one in the last quarter century, in the last 20 years or so, I would say that if you look very quickly at the reports of the various commissions across the Caribbean, it would show that republicanism has been a major demand of all of the commissions. And I'm just going to reference the St. Lucia Constitutional Reform Commission, of which I'm obviously very familiar since I was a member of that commission. And we met for 5 to 6 years. And that report was submitted to the government after 5 years or 6 years of activity and a lot of consultation with St. Lucians, both home and abroad. And what can only be described as a second major recommendation, the commission called for change to and the movement of St. Lucia, the transition of St. Lucia to republic. What the commission argued is that the constitutional monarchical system should be abolished and replaced with a republican constitutional system and the consequential termination of the personal authority of the British monarch over St. Lucia. We know that a similar position was held in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I'm not going to say that there was not support for republicanism. What St. Vincent and the Grenadines had to do, obviously, was to hold a referendum, which is something which Barbados 2021 did not have to do. And so, given the fact that the Constitution, in its level of entrenchment, requires a referendum, and again, if you go to the debate which was taking place in Parliament in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, what we saw is that given the political situation on the ground in the country at the time, there was in fact a lot of frustration, and there was the open hostility of the parliamentary opposition, not to the idea of republicanism per se, not to the idea of the termination of the British of the crown in the constitutional order St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but rather the defeat in the referendum has to be, I think, linked to the hostility of the parliamentary opposition to the entire package of reform. They were very suspicious, for instance, about the manner in which the president should be selected. And so I was very interested in what Professor Townley had to say about the current state of affairs in, for instance, in the other realms outside of the Caribbean. But the opposition, and just to give you an idea, for instance, of that blatant hostility to the entire package of reform and not to the idea of republicanism, is the fact that the opposition leader at the time, Honorable Eustace, made it very clear that the opposition would mobilize a no vote on the referendum, pointing clearly to the difficulty of removing, and I want to quote this, what he called the blinkers of party affiliation. And he argued it was very hard to remove them, and therefore a lot of the proposals, which are to change so dramatically the political scene and the constitution of St. Vincent and Grenadines, will go no way in terms of the applicability. So the opposition and the defeat in the referendum was not limited or, I would say, confined to a lack of support for a republic, but rather it was to the entire package of constitutional reforms which were being advocated by the Constitutional Reform Commission. When you look at St. Lucia, the tone of the debate in Parliament on the question of the package of proposed constitutional reform, which took place 4 years after the report was submitted in 2015, is also equally revealing. But there was again clear support for the establishment of a republic in St. Lucia, even while members of parliament, both government and opposition, were highly critical of many of the more innovative and more substantive proposals that the commission made. I think for the time left to me, I think it's important for me to say or put on the table one critical issue, and that is, it is of course entirely legitimate line of inquiry to ask why did not the political leadership of the independence movement in the Caribbean take the Caribbean outside of Dominica, outside of the Commonwealth of Dominica, take the Caribbean countries into independence as republics. The answer can be easily found in the opinions of the foremost political leaders and founding fathers of Caribbean independence. And so we can look at, for instance, the language of Sir Eric Williams well before independence in 1955, for instance. We can look at the language of Manley, for instance. And they seem to have been of a similar seem to have had a similar perspective. But certainly Eric Williams in 1955 noted, and I quote, "The time has come for when the British Constitution, suitably modified," and the emphasis is on suitably modified, "can be applied to Trinidad. After all, if the British Constitution is good for Great Britain, it is good for us." That was in 1955. Norman Manley also noted, I quote, "Let us not make the mistake of describing as colonial institutions, which are part of the heritage of this country. If we have," and he goes on, "if we have any confidence in our own individuality, we would absorb these things and incorporate them and turn them into our own use as part of our own heritage we are not ashamed of." That was in the 1950s and early 1960s. But this is now. And as I said, there are a number of developments which have been taking place in the Caribbean and elsewhere, which have certainly turned the tide. In Barbados, the movement towards republicanism was very easy. Part of the issue, as I indicated a while ago, is the fact that the Constitution of Barbados does not demand Barbados constitutionally have a referendum. But what we have seen in Barbados is that though there was no constitutional requirement for the referendum on the question of the transition to the republic, it was very clear, given the discourse we have been having in Barbados, that people felt that the political leadership in Barbados did have a moral I think, a moral responsibility to hold that referendum, which they chose not to. And that is not, in fact, to suggest that the referendum, if there was one, on the question of the republic would have been defeated in Barbados. I do not get that sense. What I do know is that in Barbados, there is not a lot of understanding of what a constitutional monarchy is. There's not a lot of understanding of what a republic is, for instance. There's not a lot of understanding of the distinction to be made between our relationship with Britain and what the Commonwealth means. So I agree, Philip. It's a very complex situation, and not many people in the Caribbean, including, and I'm going to talk about that perhaps in the discussion we're going to have tomorrow, Philip, but certainly even the more educated people in the Caribbean are not aware that there is that distinction to be made. And I just want to end my initial, comments on the debate thus far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Cynthia, for setting out so clearly not simply the complex, but the confluence of historical and short-term, the importance of perception, and the power of debates which are prevalent in the Caribbean and their failure to get recognition on this side of the Atlantic. So thank you very much indeed. Anne and Philip, are there questions that you'd like to put to each other before I open the Q&A to the floor?
No, go ahead, Sue.
I have a question, but I'll wait for you first.
My only observation was just building on something that Cynthia said about understanding. In Australia, one of the biggest problems I think we have in relation to a republic is that there hasn't been sufficient education on civics in schools, so that there's not a lot of good understanding, particularly in Australia, because we have a federal system and that's actually quite confusing. Although, having said that, devolution in the United Kingdom is way more confusing. But anyway, the federal system in Australia is not well understood. And the role of the monarchy in Australia is even more complicated because it's a built-in role at the state level as well as at the federal level. So the last time round in 1999, when we had our republic referendum, there were real difficulties about whether the federal referendum to deal with the Queen as head of state of Australia would have an impact on the role of the Queen in relation to each of the states. And then how do you get rid of the Queen at the state level, and do you have to do that separately? And because of the strange system we have, in some of the states you would have had to have had an independent referendum to remove the Queen from their constitutional system, and in others you wouldn't. And that was all very messy and very confusing. So I think because the only way we can change at the federal level is by a referendum, the difficulty with getting a referendum passed, apart from anything else, is the fact that when people don't know and don't feel sure about their knowledge of the system of government, they tend to vote no. At the Republican referendum we had in 1999, one of the mantra that was run by the people who opposed the referendum was don't know, vote no. And that was extremely successful because there were just so many people who found this all too technical and confusing, and so the consequence was they voted no.
Philip, you raised your hand.
Can I just wanted to come back on that because I think it shows you that the genius of what me and Mottley did in Barbados, which was really to ring fence the issue of the republic from that of broader constitutional change. Because once you get involved in that, it just spirals out in all directions and you'll never reach a kind of consensus and nothing will ever happen. So she moved, as Cynthia was saying, to a republic in the simplest possible way. So the powers of the Governor-General simply become the powers of the President. Indeed, the Governor-General becomes the President. And then, she says, we'll have a discussion about a broader kind of constitutional reform. And that was clearly the way to do it. I mean, the argument against that has always been, well, if you're not going to change anything else, well, what's the point? And I think the reparations issue has given some sort of a little bit more kind of moral backing to becoming a republic, partly because it simply seemed illogical for Caribbean states that retained the Queen as their head of state to, in a sense, be making claims against the Queen's government in the UK over compensation and reparations. So I think the two kind of fit together quite nicely.
Cynthia, I know that you have a view on Barbados' decision, which seemed to be simply a constitutional swap, as Philip has indicated, of the Queen for Barbados becoming a republic under a head of state, with the Governor General moving to be president. Do you feel that that was a degree an inadequate solution, or would you endorse? Would you agree with Philip's idea that having dealt with it piecemeal, there was a possibility of then moving in an evolutionary way to broader aspects of constitutional reform?
Yes, I'm going to speak a little louder because I'm seeing in the chat some people say they not heard me very well. But I agree with Philip's perspective of this. It's very clear that when you recall the debate in Barbados, there were very loud noises that what was required in Barbados was some major constitutional reform. That in fact the 1998 Constitutional Reform Commission had in fact acknowledged that there was some significant deficiencies in relation to in relation to governance in the country, and that going forward, what Barbados should have done was to simply, engage in change in one full swoop. What is also very clear is that given what I heard on the ground, it was not clear to me that if a decision was taken to sort of have broader reforms, that in fact it would have worked out very well in terms of the parliament. We must not forget that although we have a government which seemed to be in total control in terms of the parliament, that there has been one or two occasions where in fact the Senate has lodged a defeat to attempts on the part of the Barbados government to engage in some constitutional and legal reform. So that I think obviously that ring fencing, as Philip put it, was the obvious way for Barbados to go. I think one of the unfortunate things about the way in which it went down in Barbados is that people began to accept that yes, okay, we will have that change in November of 2021, and that by January 2022 we would have begun the discussion on wider constitutional reforms. Nearly 6 months after the promised reforms, the reforms that were promised, a discussion around the reforms, we are yet to see any major traction in Barbados. So I know there is discussions about the establishment of a constitutional commission that will be established very much differently to what took place with Ristac. But quite apart from perhaps communicating with some individuals about membership on the commission, and quite apart from the fact that the Attorney General made a public announcement that we have a retired judge who would chair that commission, absolutely nothing has in fact taken place in Barbados with respect to constitutional reform. And so given that, and the Caribbean is very sort of at this moment, very much focused on what is taking place in Barbados in terms of constitutional reform. And I suspect that given that hiatus, given that the fact that the discussion has not yet occurred, it might result in a situation where, if for the rest of the Caribbean, they may demand something beyond merely the transition from constitutional monarchy to a republic, and demand some additional changes, which we think are warranted. But I would yes agree that in Barbados it probably was the best thing. I don't think that given a call for republic to be established in Barbados since 1998, given the a draft constitution since 2004, a draft Republican constitution since 2004, I don't think there was much for Barbadians to in fact wait for, even though, as I indicated a while ago, it would seem to me that the majority of the population were not very clear as to why the rush towards a republic, and what in fact are the benefits of republicanism for Barbados. And I just want to say that I'm looking in the chat, and I note that there has been a comment from a former, I think he's saying that he was an attorney general I think in Montserrat, and he closed it by saying that he is an old colonialist. These are the kinds of things that we have to take in consideration in the Caribbean.
Well, he does have it in inverted commas, an unrepentant old
Yes,
colonial.
yes.
I just wanted to point that out. Colleagues, thank you very much indeed. All of you have pointed to this question of public education, and the lack of understanding and the extent to which that this is perpetuated to a degree through lack of education at the secondary school level in terms of civics, so that individuals understand the structures of their government and questions of rights. And how power is formally distributed, as well as, of course, its realities of informal, unequitable distribution. That was going to be my particular question. I have a question for Philip that picks up on Cynthia's reference to the importance of the use of language that leaders at independence, or nationalist leaders, utilized in the 1950s, which suggested that there could be a hybrid evolution of incorporating what they deemed to be the best of a British Westminster model and then adapting it to local environment. Philip, how in the archives that you've seen, how much was there an energetic pushback against this among British officialdom? You say that they were looking to simplify Britain's relations with newly independent states to encourage them to become republics, but were they relatively relaxed should they choose not to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem was one of legitimacy in that late colonial period. That some very serious thought was given about what forms of government would work best in those particular societies, and often, divided societies as a result of population movements brought about by colonialism, or the sort of rapid move towards statedom by countries where the state hadn't really reached down to a local level for very long. And you'll know, Sue, that all sorts of different kinds of, federalism, there was a sort of brief period of trying to build up from localized systems of government to the national level. But what the British government ultimately lacked in all of that was legitimacy. And that's what independence leaders demanded. And I remember one British civil servant saying, the problem is with these colonial leaders, they want constitutions with a made in Britain stamp on it. And really, as Cynthia was sort of suggesting, the case of Eric Williams, well, if it's good enough for Britain, why should we accept second best? And so in a way, it's only 60, 70 years on that often we're kind of going back and thinking about some of those models again. I think the question of African rulers, African states, it really came about in about 1961 when Tanganyika became independent as a realm, and then very quickly, within a matter of months,
Yes.
Decided that it wanted to become a republic. And Duncan Sandys, who was then the Commonwealth Secretary, decided that in a way this was a kind of double blow. It was a sort of double rejection to Great Britain. You reject Britain at independence, and then you reject them again at a sort of Republic Day ceremony. So let's get the whole business out of the way in one midnight ceremony. And that was really what got me interested in this whole subject, Sid, because whereas you would expect that the British would be urging independence leaders to hang on to the monarchy as a sort of soft power thing, actually, Sandys is putting pressure on people like Kenneth Callender to bite the bullet and become republics, even though, of course, there were also worries in Whitehall about what that would mean in terms of the creation of executive presidencies, where power would be very heavily centralized.
Thank you very much. I'll now move to the Q&A. As Cynthia's pointed out, there are questions in the chat. I'm just going to move through them, so please excuse me as well. I try and summarize. There's a question from James Bartholomew's, thanking the panelists, very informative and fascinating. Could the panel comment on whether they think the Commonwealth has a future as a multilateral organization, as opposed to a bolt-on to various countries' constitutional settlements? Well, of course, there is the separation of Commonwealth realms to the modern Commonwealth, the majority of members of which, of course, are republics, as James points out. Second question, which is associated with this, James H., could you perhaps comment on the future of the Commonwealth more broadly as an association of republics? So two questions which are related. If I could invite Anne first, your perspective from Australia, please.
Yes, I have to say I'm a little bit sceptical about the Commonwealth. I mean, we recognise that during the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, there was suddenly a rather aspirational revival of discussion about somehow the Commonwealth replacing the role of Europe as a sort of an economic source for trade, etc., etc. You know, in some way, it's just a little bit insulting because we were all, you know, rejected in terms of trade at the time when Britain entered into what was then the EC and cut off the, you know, favourable trade relationship with Australia. And all of a sudden, the Commonwealth's supposed to come back and support Britain when you got rid of, you know, your Europe connections, and suddenly we're all your friends again. I think it's quite hard to come and recreate that as your new economic empire after you've, you know, traded us in for someone else for some period of time. So I'm a bit sceptical about the Commonwealth as fulfilling that kind of a role.
Well, if I may, Anne, of course, that's the British government seeking to use the Commonwealth rather than the Commonwealth as a modern organisation, and that there is a difference between the two.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think they were trying to turn the Commonwealth into something else that it isn't, as an alternative trade bloc, which was a bit odd, and I really doubt that's coming off. I mean, in terms of the rest of the role of the Commonwealth, what is it? I mean, a lot of it was about countries supporting each other with, you know, knowledge and aid and all those sorts of things. And then you get the odd side of the Commonwealth Games as well. I mean, the Commonwealth doesn't get a lot of airplay in Australia at all, except for when we participate in the Commonwealth Games, and that's sort of about it, really. People know that it does go on a bit in the background, but it's not something that's very prominent in Australia. You know, unless we're going out there doing swimming or running or something or other, then it's a bit notable. But other than that, the Commonwealth of Nations, as opposed to the Commonwealth of Australia, really doesn't get a lot of attention in Australia, I have to say.
Right. Thank you very much, Anne. Philip, your comment.
I mean, my views on the Commonwealth, I think, are quite well known. So I don't want to rehearse them particularly, but I would say this about republicanism and the Commonwealth. What's interesting is that you know, you go way back to the London Agreement of 1949, which created this strange role for the British monarch, a personal role as head of the Commonwealth. And when you look at the papers, that very nearly didn't happen. Britain was so keen that India should remain a member of the Commonwealth as a republic. I think it would have been willing to allow that to happen on any terms, really. And you know, ministers within the Commonwealth Relations Office, I think recognise that, and that in a way that the monarchy as some sort of bond could be broken altogether. And it was really only that Nehru showed signs of being prepared to compromise and accept this compromise of this rather nebulous role, that it was created. And that has kind of created this confusion around the Commonwealth as some sort of organization which is intrinsically bound to the crown, which I think it isn't. I mean, and it's blown hot and cold over that link over the decades. So a Commonwealth of republics, I mean, it is largely that already. If it was entirely a Commonwealth of republics, I don't think the nature of the thing would change for good or for ill.
Well, of course, there are other Commonwealth countries that have monarchs as head of state, such as Eswatini,
the sort of revolving monarchy of Malaysia as well.
Well, indeed. That answers the second part of James's question about the future. Perhaps the British monarch is no longer head. Cynthia, your perspective from Barbados, please, or from the Caribbean.
Yes. Briefly, I think I was hinting to the fact that where the Caribbean is concerned, not only is there not a very clear understanding of the whole issue around republicanism and the monarchy, for instance. And I know that, again, where the Caribbean is concerned, certainly in Barbados and St. Lucia, if I could just confine it to that, there are some concerns as to whether or not being a member of the Commonwealth has, in fact, produce any tangible benefits for the majority of the people in the country. I mean, there are two positions. One is that that is all the Barbados, for instance, or St. Lucia have been able to derive, and therefore, when we move to a republic, there were questions as to whether or not the benefits that we have been able to derive from membership to the Commonwealth would continue. So there is the perception that being a constitutional republic and being a member of the Commonwealth, are one and the same thing, which, as we indicating, is in fact not the case. I have to confess that I do have some concerns with the way in which the Commonwealth is organized, the focus too on the Commonwealth. I have been taking a look at, for instance, the Charter of the Commonwealth, and I do have some concerns in relation to what the Commonwealth have or have not done. But when I say that, I'm also one of those who unfortunately do not always make the clear distinction between the Commonwealth as an international organization and of course the British government or the monarchy. It is very difficult for us to make that distinction. And to the extent, therefore, that from the Caribbean we have some concerns with both the British government and the British monarchy. To that extent, I would say, from a layman's point of view, not necessarily from the point of view of the government, because that is fundamentally different. We do have some concerns about the value of the Commonwealth to the Caribbean.
No, thank you very much indeed. A question here about, David Spence asking about the initial swap of the Governor General to President in Barbados is very simplistic or straightforward, it should be said. What happens for the next generation of head of state? Complexity returns, more of a comment there. Just flipping through. A question from Arif Zaman. Has any work been done recently, the 75th anniversary of independence year, of why Pakistan kept the Queen as theirs too for 7 years, while India took a different path? Flip, can you comment from the history and policy side of things?
Well, Harshan Kumar Singham has written very interesting, fascinating work on this. And the funny thing is that sort of Jinnah, of course, wanted the role of Governor General, and really was almost trying to create a kind of executive Governor General. And had he not died as early as he did, that would have been a very odd and interesting experiment. So yes, I mean, it was really it was partly to do with Jinnah's ambitions why the monarchy was retained in Pakistan initially for a brief period of time.
I'm just going through the chat. Mark Robinson, you'd like to make a brief comment about India and the London Declaration. Do you want to unmute yourself, Mark?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I would indeed like to. he's recognised now as the founder of what is known as the modern Commonwealth, and that is the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru, who was adamant that India would have a president, but equally wanted to keep the Commonwealth club together. And the way the Commonwealth differs from international organisations is that it is not a treaty organisation, it is literally a club. The Commonwealth Charter, now new members are expected to subscribe to it, but what exactly does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. Barbados is a very good example because its transition from having the Queen as head of state to a presidency was absolutely seamless, so seamless that they were not required to resign from the Commonwealth and reapply. They were considered to be a member of the Commonwealth, and it didn't matter whether they had the Queen as head of state or whether they had a president. There are actually 6 countries in the Commonwealth with monarchies, 6, including the Queen. So you can have any kind of constitution you want. It is up to the individual country concerned, not something the British government can dictate to you, or indeed the Commonwealth can dictate to you. Cynthia, of course, raised a very interesting question, the British Virgin Islands, because there we're talking about dependencies. I would simply say this, that if you had a referendum in the UK on whether people would want the British Virgin Islands to come under direct rule, I think you'd probably have 80% of the country would say no. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Mark. Philip, you raised your hand in response to that.
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up a point that Mark raised, that of course, when Barbados celebrated its move towards to becoming a republic, Prince Charles went out there to represent the royal family as the next head of the Commonwealth. And again, it sort of grist my mill about this whole thing not being very well understood, because journalists were talking to me and so they were saying, "Oh, of course, royals go out for these things, for independence ceremonies." I was saying, well, it's not an independence ceremony, and this is actually the first time a member of the royal family has ever gone out to a Republic Day celebration. In the past, they were kept well away from these things because it was regarded as a potential source of embarrassment. But now that Charles has been identified and recognized as the next head of the Commonwealth, his visit was a means of demonstrating that continuity which Mark was talking about.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry, there was a question about the Indigenous community as a question to Anne, please, from Hayley Brown. Would you be able to comment on the role of Indigenous Australians in the debate about Australia potentially becoming a republic? You made reference, of course, to the question of bringing Indigenous rights within the Constitution. Is there a shared Indigenous view on Australia's form of government, or is there a potential for an increased recognition of Indigenous rights under a republic? And I would like to add on a tack to that, what about the reparations issue being raised by Indigenous communities?
Yeah. So these are all extraordinarily complex issues, but to try and deal with them simply. Reparations, not so much in relation to the British Crown. I don't think anyone's trying to direct that to the United Kingdom. I think that's more an internal issue within Australia. So it comes up in a number of different contexts. So reparations for the removal of, in relation to the removal of children from families and all those sorts of things, stolen wages and all the rest of it. So those debates are going on in Australia, but they are debates where the expectations are that it's the Australian government that would deal with that rather than the British government. So it's really treated as an internal issue. In terms of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown, it's actually quite different in Australia than it is in some other countries. So in Canada, you have a very strong relationship between Indigenous peoples and this notion of the honour of the Crown, which also arises in New Zealand as well because of the Treaty of Waitangi. Not so much in Australia. In Australia, again, the debate is actually quite internal. It's not looking outside to the Queen. Unlike, say, for example, Fiji, you have the Queen is seen as one of the great chiefs and forms part of the chiefly system of Fiji because of the role of Queen Victoria at the time that Fiji was, there was cession. So the way Australia was settled was different. We don't have a Treaty of Waitangi. We didn't have the cession that Fiji had. We didn't have that relationship, that direct relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. So in Australia, the issue of the Republic is actually treated as separate from the issue of Indigenous people under the Constitution, and so much so that Indigenous people have become quite agitated at the possibility that the Republic might be dealt with first. They would prefer the issue of Indigenous people under the Constitution be treated first and settled in a system of reconciliation and treaty and various other things before we come to a republic. Back in 1999, when the Republic referendum was to go ahead, the then Prime Minister, John Howard, did try to bring in the issue of Indigenous peoples by putting in a preamble to the Constitution, which would recognise Indigenous Australians in the preamble. And there was an enormous fight about that because the terminology used and the wording used was not acceptable to most Indigenous people. So Indigenous people actually opposed the preamble, and the preamble failed even more massively than the Republic did in the two Republic questions. So since that happened, there's a fair deal of reluctance to try and conflate the two issues again. So in Australia, Indigenous people largely were treated as a separate issue to the Republic rather than bringing the two together.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. Question from Robert Hazel to Cynthia and Philip. Please, could you explain the motives behind the recent royal visits to the Caribbean? Why were they invited? What was the agenda of the three governments which invited them? To do with the Platinum Jubilee tour?
Well, I'm not sure. Sorry, and I suspect Philip might be in a better position to answer that question. I have heard Philip speak about the Foreign Office. I have heard Philip also make reference to the fact that these specific Caribbean governments would have in fact invited. I'm not so sure about the invitation, given of course the reaction of those very same governments to the visits in of themselves. Certainly we will not forget the fact that, as Philip has mentioned elsewhere, we'll not forget the fact that the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbados used the opportunity to say to the royals that in the not too distant future, Antigua and Barbuda would in fact be transiting to a republic. It doesn't also escape me that in countries like Antigua and Barbuda, and also in a sense in Grenada, that the reparations committee have also been at the loudest. So I'm not sure if the invitations were in fact issued by the Caribbean governments, or if in fact the Foreign Office made some kind of direct, I don't know, appeal to those governments to in fact facilitate a visit of the royals in the context of the fact that we are celebrating the jubilee of the Queen.
Philip, your view.
So Robert puts his finger on what was my takeaway issue really from this. And the short answer is that we don't know, and we should know the answer to Robert's question, because that would have avoided an awful lot of embarrassment.
It would.
The impression amongst many people in the Caribbean was that these visits were sort of imposed on the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And that's partly because, again, and it's coming back to your point, Sue, about education. We don't know enough about how these things operate, and partly because the palace is so keen not to release papers. So there is a Royal Visits Committee, which has met since the time Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, which brings together British officials from the Foreign Office, the Prime Minister's office, the palace. We don't have access to those minutes beyond the late 1970s. So we don't really know how the system has worked in recent years. We know that in the past, the Royal Visits Committee was absolutely clear that the British government had no role in invitations to the Queen to visit as Queen of Australia or Canada. That was entirely up to the realms themselves. But again, visits by other members of the royal family are less clear. Do the realms have a special duty or right to invite other members of the royal family? It's not absolutely clear. And in this case, in the case of the Cambridges and the Wessexes, I mean, there was a lot of blame distributed in the wake of this, including to the Foreign Office, which is probably unfair. But what the Foreign Office should have done is make it entirely clear what the nature of that transaction was. Who invited the Cambridges and the Wessexes? Did the British government make an initial approach? Did those countries proactively ask for the visits to take place? And also something that became an issue during the tours: who pays? What are the conventions about picking up the bills? Because it's quite inconsistent. I mean, again, a visit a few years ago by the Cambridges to Australia, the Australian government paid for, I think, all of the kind of internal costs and some external airfares for that. But clearly, that's not going to be expected from the Caribbean realm. So what's the nature of the deal? I think it's in the interest of the palace and the Foreign Office to be more transparent about these things.
Thank you very much indeed. Anne,
I just thought I'd add something to that because I know Philip's very interested in records of these things. You'd all be aware, of course, that, well, most of you, that the documents being the correspondence between the Governor-General of Australia, Sir John Kerr, in 1975 were released. You may not be so much aware that sometime after that, a whole stack of other documents between Governors-General and the Palace were released. So I think of about 5 or 6 other Governors-General. So we've now got an entire range of correspondence between the Palace and Australia all the way up into, I'm trying to remember now, but right into the 1980s. Anyway, in the course of reading all of those, it seems that in relation to royal tours, a lot of this is just correspondence between the palace and the relevant Governor-General as to when an appropriate time might be and what sort of interests they have. And sometimes it was initiated at the British side and sometimes it was initiated at the Australian side. And so there's a lot of toing and froing there. And it might actually be quite hard to pin your finger on who actually was inviting who in many cases. These things are often, and you've got to remember, they're planned years ahead. You know, they have these extraordinary agendas. You know, and they also usually look for occasions. So, you know, be there on the 100th anniversary of this or for the opening of that or whatever. And these things are planned 2, 3, 4 years ahead. So I think it probably is quite difficult to know those sorts of things, but it does tend to not be a binary, you know, we asked, you came. It's a lot more toing and froing.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm just going to take one more question because I'm conscious we're approaching the hour. A question from Sufi KB, who is a postgraduate student from Asia-Europe Institute at the University of Malaya. As a Malaysian, the Institute of Republicanism is not common in Malaysia, so this issue is illuminating, so her sincere thanks. She has 2 questions, one to Professor Anne and Professor Philip. Aside from the legalistic perspective, will there be an impact on the societal level? Sorry, my thing's just flipped. In the UK and Australia, should Australia become a republic, do societies feel indifferent on republicanism should it happen, or will there be any pushbacks? So it's associated with national identity, not simply on the legal framework. And a question to Professor Cynthia and Professor Anne, does public sentiment change to republicanism akin to independence does republicanism mean the final independence from the UK?
Well, maybe I'll just start on this thing. I got dobbed into both of these. First of all, in Australia, probably there is a distinction drawn between republicanism and independence. As far as Australia is concerned, it is independent, so that's not a problem. And indeed, that is a problem for the whole republicanism thing, because it would be easier to argue that we need to be a republic if we needed to become independent. But if we already say we are independent, then that brings to the essential problem that's being pointed out there. Well, what's the extra benefit you get from this? And, you know, it's actually quite hard, again, to put your finger on it. I mean, there is a, you know, greater sense of nationalism and independence if you've got your own head of state who's one of you, who lives there. You know, maybe they can represent your country better to the world. The Queen isn't exactly going out and representing Australia to the rest of the world, because she's head of state of a whole lot of other countries as well. And you know, and we know that she doesn't barrack for our, you know, Australian football team or whatever it is. I mean, when it comes to the Olympics, she's barracking for Britain. She's not barracking for us. So it is a bit odd having a head of state who actually doesn't speak with your accent, doesn't live in your country, doesn't sort of support your own sporting teams, etc., etc. But that's small beer in the scheme of things, and that's one of the other reasons why republicanism doesn't have a huge amount of support in Australia, because it's actually quite hard to say what are the substantive benefits that you will get from this. In the end, to the extent that the British really don't interfere in Australia, we are independent. We know we're independent. The Queen's not doing anything obnoxious. She can happily live there as status quo without causing any grief. Look, I appreciate the position's probably completely different in the Caribbean, but from an Australian point of view, it's actually been quite hard to manufacture the answer as to why we need a republic. Most commonly, it's said that, you know, each Australian should have the right and the ambition to be able to be head of state, and it's an exclusive position that excludes all of us, and that's a wrong thing. So you can see that argument, but, you know, does it make a huge difference to us all in the end? Probably not.
Thank you very much. Philip, your comments, please, before I move to Cynthia.
Just very quickly on this very interesting question about what the impact might be of Australia becoming a republic on the UK. And I think the one of the key things to say is that the palace has been absolutely consistent in not fighting a kind of rearguard action to preserve the realms. The main interest of the palace is in preserving the Commonwealth. But it's very clear from insiders that they felt that the Republican cause failing in the 1999 election was a little bit of a boost for them in what had been a very, very messy decade in the UK, that actually it somehow kind of reflected well on them. So I don't think you can say that it's not going to have any kind of impact on the way in which the palace and the royal family are perceived if Australia does, more broadly, and perceived in Britain, if Australia does become a republic.
Thank you. Cynthia, your view.
Yes, thank you. Let me see if I can respond to that. I think insofar as the Caribbean is concerned, there has always been a call for, well, I shouldn't say always, but certainly over the last few decades, what we have been seeing is a conversation which, in a sense, equates the right of, a national to become a head of state with independence. So even Mia Mottley herself has long argued, the Prime Minister of Barbados has in fact long argued that the time had come for Barbados in its political development, where every single Barbadian, for instance, this is how she likes to put it, where every single Barbadian, for instance, could have the ambition of becoming a head of state, and that was in fact not the case. There's also, of course, certainly in terms of what we heard from Professor Tony a while ago, that certainly where the Caribbean countries were concerned, it is the case that we feel that it is impossible for for Queen Elizabeth, for instance, to represent all of the realms in the way that, in fact, perhaps she could represent the UK or in fact Britain. As to whether or not there is the same emphasis placed on republicanism as there was emphasis on independence, I would say that in the public imagination, clearly there is not that. I mean, the government is trying to sell it in that way in terms of appealing to people to support the transition to a republic. But certainly in the public's view, they do not necessarily equate republicanism in the same way that we think it is important for us to, for countries like perhaps Anguilla or Montserrat today to move towards independence. I think for the Caribbean, one of the critical things that we need to take in consideration, and that is certainly something that I believe that Philip has done work on, is the fact that when you look at our independent constitutions, they still continue to be orders in council of the British government. And that is one of the things that people like Trevor Monroe and, Professor Simeon McIntosh had been very concerned about, that what we needed to do was to patriate our constitutions. And that is what in a sense, the transition to a republic would be doing for the Caribbean. So that in a nutshell, what I would argue is that many of the persons who have done work on republicanism and, amendments to our constitutions have in fact been arguing in the Caribbean, is that the transition to a republic would certainly close the final circle of independence. Well, if of course those countries had also in fact removed the Privy Council as the final court of appeal. So there are two things that in the post-independence period that a number of people who are interested in the constitutional arrangements in the Caribbean have been asking for, that would really set them really set them up as genuinely independent countries. And I question the issue of course, the genuine independence, because to the extent that we can't control our own economic destiny, we could never be genuine independence. But nonetheless, in terms of the transition from having the British Privy Council as a final court of appeal for the Caribbean has been very important, and there has been very little traction in that regard. And secondly, of course, simply removing the Queen from our existing constitutional order has been the other issue which has, in a sense, occupied some of the thinking of Caribbean political and political elites. I wouldn't say economic elites, but certainly the political elites.
Thank you very much indeed, Cynthia. My sincere thanks to all our panelists for their highly knowledgeable and engaged contribution, and for the range and specificity of questions from the floor. I apologize that I haven't been able to incorporate all of them, but I know that this has been an excellent seminar which has highlighted the complexities, the historic drivers, the longer term and shorter term impulses and likely directions for the future. But what is certainly true is that there is, because of her long reign, a conflation of monarchy and Queen Elizabeth I in people's minds, in their insidious assumptions. And certainly it is going to be a seismic event when the Queen is no longer with us. But as Anne said at the start, events, who knows how they may play out. And so the future is not yet certain, even though there are certain firm indicators of likely direction of travel. So thank you very much indeed to everybody.